everyone. I'm Felicity Broennan with AlgaePlanet.com. And today my guest is Dr. Elizabeth Cottier-Cook, who is joining us from Scotland. Dr. Cottier-Cook is a professor in marine biology at the University of the Highlands and Islands, based at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, also known as SAMS. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, head of the SAMS United Nations University Associate Institute. She's the PI for Global Seaweed Star, which is an international global challenge research fund program. And she is the program leader for the Erasmus Mundus Joint Master Degree in Aquaculture, Environment, and Society. Dr. Cottier-Cook has published over 68 peer-reviewed papers, ranging from global seaweed aquaculture industry to the environmental impacts of aquaculture to marine invasive species and biosecurity. She recently also led the development of biosecurity guidance for marine invasive non-native species, which is now being used by environment agencies across the UK. And she has worked in collaboration with colleagues in China, Canada, Chile, New Zealand, the US, and numerous other countries. I have to apologize. I feel like I've left out about 95% of your qualifications, but I think it would take about 20 minutes to cover. So let me just say, Dr. Cottier-Cook, thank you for taking the time to be with us on AlgaePlanet today. It's an honor to have you.
Well, thank you so much, Felicity. Thank you.
I want to begin by asking you something I've wondered about regarding seaweed as a kind of fix-all. In other words, seaweed, as we know, is being called upon to solve a lot of our global crises, from asparagopsis being fed to livestock, to lower methane emissions, to replacing synthetic plastic with bioplastics, to kelp as the carbon sink, ... And I'm curious what your perspective is on whether or not this is realistic. Is it scalable? Is it even desirable from an ecological standpoint? And can we grow enough seaweed to have an impact in all these domains?
Yeah, thank you, Felicity. That's a really good question to begin with. I, through Global Seaweed Star, have worked now with many people all over the globe. It's been a fantastic opportunity to network, particularly with colleagues in developing countries. That's where the majority of our focus has been. And also developing new networks with colleagues, particularly in Southeast Asia and China, where they already have massive scales of seaweed farms. It's not a new thing. It's already done. You can see seaweed farms from, using satellites in space. You only have to look, at Korea, South Korea, China. There are bays full of seaweed cultivation lines in China. There's huge bays where seaweed cultivation happens in between wind farms. I mean, it is already being done on a massive scale in these countries. So absolutely, there is the possibility of upscaling seaweed culture. It's the fact that for many of us, in Europe, for me, in Europe, in the States, it's just not in our culture. We don't cultivate seaweed. We never have. We buy it in from Southeast Asia and other countries. But if there is the will and the legal and political will and frameworks to allow the seaweed to be cultured on such a grand scale, then absolutely it is possible. It's proven. It's there. You can see it from space. So, so in terms of it being a sort of, looking at it from an ecosystem restoration point of view, from a carbon capture point of view, yeah, there's a lot in the news at the moment. There's a lot of people, rightly so, I think, in a way, getting quite excited about the use of seaweeds in this way, as well as it obviously being provided, for food and things like that. But, and it's interesting that there have been a few studies, and I must say there's just few studies done in places like China and Southeast Asia, where they have got the big farms where they can look at this. But as I stressed, there's only a few studies. At the moment, I'm working with a European team of experts to actually do a full literature review. I mean, we've looked at we're just looking, we've looked at 500 papers, we've narrowed it down to 200 papers now, and we're just literally doing this at the moment to figure out how much work has actually been done on some of these subject areas. And there's not a huge amount actually in the literature of it being proven. So at the moment, all I'm saying is that there are like a handful, like less than 10 studies that have shown that the benefits of the seaweeds to sort of wider ecosystem services, they're called. But ultimately, there's still a lot more work to be done to prove that it is actually for real. And hopefully over the next sort of 5-10 years, that work is going to be done, because there are many, many countries seriously looking at upscaling their seaweed industries. And hopefully this can be one of those beneficial payoffs, trade-offs for doing that. So it's kind of hanging in the balance at the moment. So I can't give you a hard or fast kind of like yes or no, but it's kind of watch this space, I'm afraid.
But that is very exciting that not everybody is starting from where we are in our European and the US levels, that it's very far along, as you say.
Oh yeah, they've been culturing seaweeds for, well, in China, hundreds of years, but in the Philippines, culturing them on a significant scale for over 50 years now. They're way ahead of us. And that was one of the benefits of working with our partners through the Global Seaweed Star program. It's funded by the UK Research and Innovation Fund. It was £6.2 million that the UK taxpayers basically invested in this program. And it was all about basically taking UK scientific capability and sharing it with our partners in developing countries. But to be quite honest, we've learned as much, if not more, from our partners in many ways, in terms of sort of the scale of the seaweed industry and how it can be done, that we're going to be bringing back, hopefully, and sharing with our partners here in Europe and in America. So it's been like a really fantastic sort of two-way capacity building exercise, really, over the last 4 years. It's been great from that respect.
So in your capacity as someone who has been designated by the United Nations to safeguard the global seaweed industry with these biosecurity tools and practices, tell us what the greatest concerns are that need most urgent attention in terms of the growing interest in macroalgae.
Yeah, well, yeah, so we launched a policy brief. I led a team of experts back in 2016. And we used a policy brief back then, and it was all about safeguarding the industry. And we've just released another policy brief, excitingly, about sort of a couple of weeks ago. Again, sort of 30 different institutes, more than 30 experts from around the world came together to put that policy brief to launch that policy brief and write it. And we, as I say, work together with the United Nations University, which is great, to actually help us to launch this and to produce the policy brief. And yeah, the key, really, we're finding with our partners, and this is where the Global Seaweed Star program came in, that biosecurity that was so important. Sort of around 20% of the crop can be lost, or 20% of global seaweed production can be lost each year just through outbreaks of pests and disease. In some countries, whole farms can be wiped out in a matter of days, and that can be devastating for the seaweed farmers, particularly, since it's pretty much all their savings and everything is invested in these farms. And so that was a real key crux of the work that we've been doing over the last 4 years. And yeah, real key messages to take away is that, unlike terrestrial crops, many sort of maize, wheat, rice, there are international organizations that are set up to guide and provide advice to policymakers and what have you around those crops. We're really finding that even though seaweed, in terms of production volume in the marine environment, in marine aquaculture, is second only to finfish. I mean, there's 30 odd million tons produced every year. there's very little biosecurity guidance for that, for the industry at all. And most of the time it's just sort of lumped under the sort of lumped within the aquaculture industry. It's never given any sort of specific detail that the national, even at international level, that sort of national governments and environment agencies and then extension officers can really take and you know, there's just nothing there for them to provide advice to the growers. And so the growers just do the best they can, and under some trying circumstances they really do so well. But we've just found that I think it really would make such a difference if there was more seaweed specific policies and regulations out there to help the farmers in trying to minimize both the introduction and then the spread of pests and disease should there be an outbreak. So yeah, so just helping with further guidance, helping with further policies at each national level, but then also offering the farmers some practical guidance as well, what to do if there is an outbreak, because it's provided, you know, with the shrimp industry, with finfish, with salmon, with everything else, but nothing's been there so far for the seaweed industry, and that's where we've come in to help produce that. And this is some of the key things that we've put in our policy brief as well.
Well, that's really, it sounds so incredibly important, because it seems like you say, it can be wiped out in a matter of a few days, and then and that it would go from farm to farm very quickly if they're in shared waters.
Yeah,
So
and a lot of the farmers, you know, there aren't nurseries, there aren't seed nurseries in many of these countries where they can go and restock and resupply. So they turn to their neighbors or other family relatives to provide them with new stock to build up the next harvest. But that stock, because we're in the marine environment, these pests and disease, they're not contained. They go with the water, they go with the currents. And so they could be bringing in stock that already has disease or pests held within it. And they're not entirely sure what to be checking for, what to be looking for. So it's sort of like a vicious circle, and they can't escape from that. But just with some of the few kind of pointers that we've been able to provide, based on some of the sort of experiments that we've been able to do over the last 4 years, hopefully, fingers crossed, will be, you know, we've produced guidance now, posters, brochures. It can all be found on the globalseaweedstar.org website. You know, it's free to download. There's as I say, brochures, posters, guidance, new sort of manuals, all with the biosecurity message embedded in there. And we also, obviously, there's a number of YouTube videos as well that we've produced that, again, freely accessible for people to have a look at if they're ever unsure of what they're seeing on their farm.
wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So going back to Global Seaweed Star, will you just give everyone an overview of what led to that program and its successes?
Oh gosh, right. Oh, it goes back a few years now, probably goes back about 6 or 7 years. And I was working with a colleague here at SAMS, Dr. Claire Gachon. She was an expert in, or she is an expert in seaweed, particularly fungal diseases. And she was obviously going to different conferences around the world and came back, and we were talking about, you know, my background being in biosecurity and working with invasive species. I was really interested because a number of seaweeds that are cultured in Southeast Asia, particularly Capophycus alvarezi, the red carrageenophyte, that's actually been now, is now farmed in over 30 countries worldwide. So with my invasive species hat on, there were sort of alarm bells ringing. You know, why is this being allowed to happen? Why is it being so easily spread from one country to another? And Claire was just hearing reports about how basically people were importing it, just cuttings, because it was through clonal propagation, just cuttings, growing it up. Farms were doing fantastically well for the first 10 years, and then bang, they were just being just outbreak of disease, and that was it. They were gone. And it was reoccurring in different countries just seemed to be okay for 10 years, and then the farm was destroyed. And so she got some funding with myself and a couple of other colleagues through, it was the UK Natural Environmental Research Council that had an International Opportunities Fund. So we got a small amount of money, about 250,000, just to start putting together some workshops. It was just a couple of years worth of money. We started to get international experts coming across to us here in Scotland, and starting to build up that network. And then as part of that particular fund, I published the 2016 policy brief. And I couldn't get over the response that we had from that. I mean, it's been cited in pretty much every continent that grows seaweed, I think, and has had, you know, I think it's like 120 odd citations, which is really quite good in other scientific papers. So was really blown away by the response that we had to that. And at the same time, so in 2000 and where are we now? 2016, 17, there was a call came out by the UK government, by the research and innovation team, looking at all about working with developing partners. So it's all about building capacity and sharing research expertise with partners in, as I say, in developing countries. And 95% of seaweed is grown in developing countries. So it was just a no-brainer. And we'd already established our partners in, you know, particularly in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Tanzania, and then we had other partners, of course, in Korea and China. So we built this network thanks to the previous grant that we had. We built the network, we published that policy brief explaining exactly what was needed, you know, in the recommendations on the back page. And so it was just, it was just meant to, I always say it was fate. It was just meant to be. And we wrote the proposal, and the UK government picked 32 proposals in the round that I went. It was called the Global Challenges Research Fund. 32 proposals were funded. And I always remember, I shouldn't mention his name, but a certain person very high up in one of the research councils said, there's no way something on seaweed is going to be funded, because a lot of the work that was funded was to do with malaria and tobacco, and it was more medically orientated. But just it, you know, as I say, the stars aligned and it was funded, and I'm so glad that it was, because I'm hoping that, I mean, we worked out, I think there's probably about 6 million farmers directly involved in the industry, and then you have all the other people that are involved indirectly. So and you know, and it's some of the sort of poorest nations that, you know, coastal communities that are involved. And when you visit some of the farms in the Philippines, I unfortunately couldn't get out there because of COVID, but my colleagues did, and my postdoc did. And you know, some of these communities in the Philippines particularly, they live on they live in villages that are built on stilts in the middle of these huge bays, and they have their seaweed farms around them. And it is very much a community-based farm. Everyone takes part in the growing in different stages of the harvesting and processing process. And, you know, and the whole family and the whole community, their benefits. And of course, if half their crop gets wiped out through a disease outbreak, then that has really serious implications on their livelihoods and on their welfare. So I'm really glad that we've been able to do this project and help in a small way. Well, we don't want the network to end. You know, we've all done that. We've probably, you know, we've got the core partners. We also had we had almost £1 million UK pounds devoted to a research fund. So not only have we worked with our core partners, as I say, in the Philippines, Tanzania and Malaysia, but we've also worked with probably another 14 different countries around the world involved in seaweed farming. We were providing grants of up to £50,000 for a 12-month project. So you can imagine we've built our network now, so it really is global. And we don't want to lose that. So I think we've already said that we'll try and host sort of meetings 3 times a year, just virtual meetings between us, looking for other opportunities for funding. I know things are difficult at the moment with the pandemic and what have you, and funding being tied up and directed towards that, which of course it should be. But so we're looking to maybe look for other funds to continue with the network, but also continue the work on the biosecurity. And it's quite exciting. I've been involved with the UN FAO organization, and we've been working with them for a couple of years now, because they've been producing something called a new initiative called the Progressive Management Pathway for Aquaculture Biosecurity. So that covers the entire industry, but it's like an umbrella initiative, as it were, and then the different sectors are looking to maybe write their own particular biosecurity sort of guidance under that. And we've done that for seaweed. So it's called the Progressive Management Pathway, Aquaculture Biosecurity for seaweed. You know, it's within that. And, you know, hopefully there will be one produced for shrimp and one produced for tilapia and carp and everything else. So, so we have written that, and we hope to have that published. I'm literally sitting on the final draft of the manuscript. So hopefully by the end of this week, it will be sent off to the journal. And then, of course, I'm hoping that we can work with, because it's very much aimed at national government level. And that's what I'm hoping now, that we can get further funding to work with each of these national governments to help them develop a national strategy for seaweed biosecurity per se. And I think the benefits at the moment well outweigh the negatives. The key thing at the moment is, of course, finding places to grow the seaweeds which have enough nutrients. You know, if you go too far offshore, you'll be stuck for growing. And I don't think we really want to get into I don't think we want to get into putting in extra fertilizers into the oceans to grow these seaweeds, sort of artificial fertilizer. I don't, you know, in my view, we don't want to go down that route. But so site selection is going to be really important when upscaling these farms. But I think if that's done well and thought through carefully, I think it could be done. It could be done really well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So given this decade of ocean science for sustainable development, what do you think we'll see at the end of this decade? Like I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that we can increase the number of farms, we can increase the number of uses, we can provide seaweed as a potential food security source, you know, things like that to help feed the thing. Warming oceans, is that gonna be a problem, or are there seaweeds that we can grow in warmer oceans?
Yeah.
I mean, ocean rise, those kinds of things.
Yeah, obviously there is going to be some need, and that's one of the things we've been looking at, is looking at more temperature tolerant species of seaweed. I mean, they've obviously in Tanzania, there's been huge issues there, particularly because they grow the seaweeds in shallow water. So the women who typically farm the seaweeds, they can get to them at low tide. The Kappa ficus seems far more susceptible to these increasing temperatures than the eucuma, the red carrageenophytes. So there may well be having to look for more temperature tolerant species of seaweeds to grow, to farm, and that is underway. In China, they're already breeding species and variants that are more temperature tolerant. So obviously that will need to be looked at quite carefully. But, you know, for me, there is so much space in between these offshore wind farms at the moment that I think, you know, they've already proven in China that you can grow seaweeds and other aquaculture species successfully in between these farms. I think there's going to be a lot more push towards the multi-use of sites. They're already doing that in parts of Belgium. The legislation has changed. So if you wanted to put in a wind farm, you have to look at other ways in which you can use the space around it. And seaweed is one of those areas that is being looked at. So, I think in the next decade, there is going to be a lot more looking very closely at the planning, at marine spatial planning, looking at how you can combine different maritime activities in one area. And yeah, looking at, I think we have farms here in Europe that are on the sort of up to, say, like 100 hectares. I mean, you're talking of thousands of hectares in Southeast Asia and China. So I think we're going to be beginning to see a bit of a catch up, I think, from countries that are don't traditionally produce seaweeds. I'd like to think there would be a bit of a catch up where we go to these much, much larger scale seaweed farms. But of course, and this is what we're looking at in this review, this big literature review that we're doing as part of a European consortium, is looking at, well, what could be those negatives? What could be the disservices to ecosystem function of upscaling this kind? So we do still need to be aware that we have to think about what other consequences could there be in upscaling to such a degree. So I think, yeah, 10 years time, I think there'll be a big change. But there's got to be a lot of work in the meantime, making sure that change is happening in a sustainable way, and that the change, and this is one thing coming back to the policy brief, making sure that change and that upscaling does not remove those small scale farmers from the picture. That whatever happens, those small scale farmers who are the sort of backbone of the industry at this moment in time, particularly in Southeast Asia and Africa, that they are not left behind and just, the big multinationals come in and just remove them from the picture. So I think that's a big thing just to make sure we keep an eye on over the next decade.
Well, I think there's a lot more awareness about those kinds of human justice pieces. I hope there is. And yes, that would be such a critical thing to keep in mind, to keep them working. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the other thing, the other thing that we found is that we've been looking quite a lot at gender and the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, in the Philippines in particular, the whole family are involved in growing the seaweeds, the whole community, the whole family. In Tanzania, it's predominantly the women that work the seaweed farms. So it's also important to make sure that any training or any new measures that are put into place also we're calling it gender sensitive, so the training isn't always biased towards the men, who can sometimes, it's easier for them to get away because they don't maybe have the young children to look after. Or in Tanzania, they say, okay, don't farm the seaweeds in the shallow water, take them and farm them in slightly deeper, cooler waters. But that involves a boat, that involves maintaining an engine for the boat. It involves being able to swim. And a lot of the female farmers, they can't swim, seaweed farmers, they can't swim. They're not interested really in running a boat and looking after engines. So it's more complicated than just move the seaweed to deeper water. And it's making sure that those female seaweed farmers are empowered and that they can still grow their seaweeds even under any new measures or regulations that are introduced.
It is complicated. It is very complex. Yes. And I'm so grateful that you are there as an advocate and a voice and just a powerhouse to keep it all sort of corralled and moving in some unified direction, I hope.
Fingers crossed.
Yes. Yeah. So you hinted at this, but what I would say, what I'd like to ask is, What would be your most prescient message to the aquaculture industry at this point?
To the entire aquaculture industry or to the seaweed aquaculture industry?
Well, we can keep it to the seaweed. I mean, yeah.
What would be the most precedent message? I think in terms of just being aware of, obviously people are very keen to upscale the industry, and I fully am behind that because I can think it can bring incredible positive benefits. But as you say, upscaling will come with other issues. Biosecurity, obviously I have to mention that, biosecurity being one, but also just, as I say, making sure that there are safeguards in place. We talk about safeguarding this, the aquaculture industry, making sure that and I'm not, that there are guidelines and there are policies and what have you that are in place that make sure that the industry is upscaled in a responsible way that means that it's not going to be a sort of boom and bust. It's going to be there for the significant future, and it's going to provide a stable and fair livelihood for the people. And hopefully many of those people will be small scale farmers, but a fair livelihood and transparent, particularly, with the pricing, and that additional, help and training is given to those small scale farmers so they can add value to their products. They can make that little bit more money and not just produce the crop and then sell it on for a basic cost. So there's a lot in there. Sorry, Felicity, there was a lot in there, but I think in terms of, yes, making the industry upscale it, but in a sustainable, resilient and fair way to all the farmers involved and the stakeholders. I could talk about this subject, Felicity, I'm sure you're aware, all day, but I think we've covered everything. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
great
thank
questions.
you so much. I so appreciate you being with us today, and thank you for joining us on AlgaePlanet.com, and thank you to our viewers for watching this, and we appreciate you, and we'll see you again soon.